a lot of data, certainly nothing about APIs and such. I'm going to talk about how or if hardware is the new software in a philosophical sense. I'm going to give a couple words about myself. I come from a completely different background from everybody I've met here, so I put in this slide just, I'm not a software guy. I studied environmental engineering, aerospace engineering, atmospheric physics, stuff like that. All hard stuff. So that's where I'm coming from. Let's see. So, what investors, startups, the general public thinks about hardware versus software. Well, software is fast and cheap. Small teams can do a lot with software. You have low capex, small generalized teams. People can learn different parts of the architecture along the way. You have open source APIs, etc. Whereas hardware, expensive, slow, high capex. You need to build stuff. You need to build factories. You have large specialized teams, people who know about little bits of the hardware, the electrical engineering components, etc. Things are closed, proprietary. They're physically far away, so you can't just get on the internet and you have your new part. Software is easy to scale. There's no logistics. Control C, and you've got a new version of your software. Hardware is hard to scale. You have to build supply chains. You have to build tooling and manufacturing. Software, thus, is, if you're lucky, if you're one of the lucky few, and your software gets taken up, extremely profitable, huge margins. Hardware has very low margins because you're competing everything with the Chinese, and high marginal costs. Because you want to build another car, you've got to build another factory to build another car. You can't just Control C that out. So software has a really low barrier to entry. I've met quite a few startups here, a couple guys with an idea, and they're a company. Not quite so easy in the hardware business. So quite high barriers to entry. And why is that? Because software is information. Software is ideas. And I made an analogy here to software, ideas, information versus hardware, which is molecules. Okay? You have Sherlock Holmes here. He's an idea. He can have any number of possibilities. It's all just in your imagination what that book is. Hardware, you're limited by what molecules can do. You have to manipulate molecules to get the product you want. So you get a story with software, but you get an autobiography with hardware. Okay? And now I can, if I ever have a conversation, I can tell if you're a hardware or software person immediately by the first reaction to this question is somebody comes at you and says, why don't they do the X, whatever it is? Why don't they have so-and-so? Software person just says, well, maybe they do, or I wonder how many programmers it will take to get that done. Maybe it'll be 6 years of work to do the new Twitter, for instance, we saw just now. Or maybe it's a week's work to develop a new app. A hardware guy thinks, is that physically possible? First. Can it be done at all? Does the physics, chemistry allow it? Okay, so we can look at this concept as what I call a possibility space. Okay? So you have a number of possibilities. I'm choosing three because it's three-dimensional space. We're all familiar with three-dimensional space. There can be infinite number of possibilities. Okay? For Sherlock Holmes, the possibility space might be the place, London, the time, late 1800s England, the characters, Sherlock Holmes, Moriarty. And then you create a story based on those parameters, and there's your story. But it could be anything. It could be Sherlock Holmes in space. It could be Sherlock Holmes 10,000 years ago. That all those options are open to you as a creator of this literature. Okay? But if we look so that all the space, everything is available to you. It's just the time and effort it takes to program that or write that novel. Okay? But now let's look at the iPhone. What if you want to make an iPhone? Well, it's not the whole world. You have limitations. For instance, does the clicker work? No. So you have the available materials. Can the materials do what you want them to do? Right? Are they strong enough? Do they conduct enough electricity? Are they flexible enough, et cetera, et cetera? And then you have, for instance, another example, the available manufacturing. Let's say you have this great material, but you can't make the part you need to do the thing you want. Well, it's of no use to you. Okay? So where these two intersect, that's the space that you can play with. Your iPhone has to fit in that space. Okay? And you can add more and more constrictions and more constrictions, And that space gets smaller and smaller, and what you're left with is reality, what you can actually do. Okay, so how do we make hardware, which is constricted by physics, more like software, which is constricted only by your imagination? So, the obvious thing is we have to make both these bubbles bigger, right? More overlap, more possibilities. One way to do that, and what's been traditionally done, is large-scale manufacturing. Make a hell of a lot of it. You can make it a hell of a lot cheaper. This has been around a long time. Interestingly, I recently discovered that the first actual mass manufacturing was the Venetian arsenal in 1104, mass manufacturing ships to fight the Persians in the 1100s. They had what we would call a modern mass manufacturing facility. They had interchangeable parts, they had standard designs, and they did it all in a series, and it was what we call mass manufacturing. The Gutenberg press, similar, although the Chinese say that was discovered by them 300 years earlier, about the same time as the Venetian arsenal. It's an old idea. What does that do? That doesn't change the technology, but that moves that blue bubble to the left, meaning that possibility space is more open. Okay? Now, startups can use this to their advantage, even though they don't have that kind of muscle to build a factory, because there are a rising number of contract manufacturers in the world. This is something that has exploded over the last 20 years. It's the reason for the growth of China. China is the manufacturing hub of the world. Everybody sends their stuff to China to get built by contract manufacturers. And Foxconn, of course, is the most famous. They built for Apple. But there's many, many, many more, like Electronics and Jabil. There's also these multifunctional SoCs, system on a chip. So you can do quite advanced things with a standard piece. There's supply chain and distribution partners you can now purchase, which was not available 20 years ago. And there's new distribution channels, for instance, Kickstarter and Indiegogo, where you can immediately go to the customer as a hardware manufacturer with your idea, with their money, pre-order products, get it built, and send it to people directly. Okay? There's also things like software-upgradable hardware. You can upgrade your Tesla on the go. They download hardware, change the configuration of your motor, etc., and voila, you have a better car. And what's happening recently now is these brand and contract manufacturers are now supporting hardware startups because they want people to use their brands and they want people to use their manufacturing facilities. So they're helping to build the hardware companies that can use their services. Okay? So the idea there is you bring outside economics of scale in-house, outside economics of scale in-house as a service. And that's quite a recent model. And I actually did this once. I ran a crowdfunding campaign for this rollable keyboard, and everything was set up. Distribution network, Indiegogo, manufacturing partners in China, etc. Unfortunately, this was not a success. I didn't get enough money to start the project. But one guy and the cost of a pizza, literally, I was able to get a market for a product that didn't exist yet. So, other ways. What do you want to do to increase the size of the interaction? Well, a lot of people are talking about 3D printing as the way hardware becomes more like software. That's also an old idea. This is a clay figurine made about 2,000 years BC. And what it's showing here is the same concept as 3D printing 2,000 years ago. He's layering on pottery, layer by layer, in a potter's wheel. Okay? It's an old idea. What's made different is the digitization of it with 3D printing. And with 3D printing, you can also go back now, scan an object, create a model of it, digitize it so you can do this digitization of the printing, and then you might have to finish and assemble it later. But the concept is the same. It's just digitized, and which means the designs, for instance, are freely exchangeable, and you can download designs and theoretically print them at home. Okay? There's also a revolution going on in the open source hardware. You might have seen the talks this morning about the hacker communities for making things. There's free CAD software now. There's open standards, interchangeable standards. There's hacker communities which develop, for instance, voxels, ready modules you can paste together to make your hardware. There's cheap scanning technology, so you can look at that chair in front of you, scan it, and recreate it on your 3D printer. And of course, the printing machines are getting cheaper and cheaper, and the materials are getting cheaper and cheaper. Okay? And actually, I have an example here. There's now downloadable cars. You can download a car, the design of a car, and you can theoretically print it in your garage if you have a good enough printer. Okay? So 3D printing is becoming much more like software. It's info-driven, it's digital, it's scalable, it's fully automated, it's modular, and interchangeable. It allows you virtually complete design freedom within the materials parameters you have. There's virtually no barrier to entry, the cost of the raw materials, the cost of the printing machine, and then you can start printing objects. And it's local and logistics free except for the raw materials. So you just buy the rolls of materials that you're going to print, and you can print anything you want locally. And you can print all sorts of stuff, from art objects to motorcycles. That's of course not an operating motorcycle yet, but we're getting close to be able to print an operating motorcycle. You can print food, you can print replacement body parts, and you can print pretty fine objects as well. So what does that do to your availability options in your possibility space? Well, it increases your manufacturing options, but it doesn't decrease your costs. So it somewhat increases your space. And actually, if you want to stay in the 3D printing world, it limits your available materials quite significantly. So your materials ball gets much smaller. So there's not many things yet you can do with 3D printing, okay? So your options are relatively limited. So today, the uses are for fast prototyping, iterations for instance, A/B testing, rapid manufacturing for small volume, unique one-off designs, for instance, like prosthetics, body replacement parts, or one-off things. One coming application is virtual inventory. So you make a refrigerator, and you need to have, when you build that refrigerator, you need to have parts for replacing broken parts in that refrigerator for years to come. Well, why not just have CAD? You print the parts as needed, the replacement parts as needed, and that gives you a long tail, so-called long tail for replacement parts. It's used for otherwise unmanufacturable objects. For instance, I have here an example of cool turbine blade in an aircraft engine. It's a very complicated thing, a turbine blade in an aircraft engine. It has all sorts of passages inside to allow air to flow in to cool the blade, and there is no other technique available to make it. So you actually have to 3D print this thing. It's very expensive, 100,000 euros to print your turbine blades for your aircraft, but it's the only way to do it. Okay, of course, art, design, amusement, and reconstruction of things. And I mentioned that Indiegogo campaign for the rollable keyboard. We actually used 3D printing for this to print and modify our prototypes. And it was a very quick and easy process to come up with a usable and friendly device this way. Tomorrow, as the costs go down, this will expand. The idea is you have true local or home manufacturing. You have like a microwave oven in your kitchen, you have it in your garage, and you download your files and you print your new iPhone. Okay? That's a long way away, and I'll explain why. Okay? There's medium volume manufacturing. For instance, for automobiles, you don't produce billions of automobiles, you produce hundreds of thousands of them, and this, for some parts, is economical and makes sense. There are things where it's logistics limited. For instance, parts in the field. If you're in the middle of Antarctica, and there's no way you can get a new part, you can print something on your 3D printer. And I guarantee you in space, on the first trip to Mars, they'll have lots and lots of 3D printers. Okay? Things like imitation foods. So they have the look and feel of foods they're used to, but they're not real. Those are now being done by 3D printing. And medical and bioprinting. For instance, someday we'll be printing organs. We're already printing things like ears, artificial livers, so those kind of halfway 3D printed, but that's happening. But these will never undercut traditional high volume manufacturing. These are for specialty products. But here's an example of something that was recently 3D printed in the medical industry, a pill that dissolves easily in your mouth. So you just need a little sip of water and the pill dissolves, and it's done by 3D printing. I can't imagine that this couldn't have been done another way. I think this is a publicity thing more than anything. But anyway, some real products, mass market products, are now being made by 3D printing. So, but 3D printing is really 3D printing and scaling and even like subtractive manufacturing, like I have here at the bottom. These are all old technologies. They've been made better by digitization, but the ideas are still the same. Okay? The idea is essentially you have a design, you have a process to take that design into a product. And that's top-down manufacturing. You start with the idea, the design, and the process to get from A to B, and you do that. But what about this? That's not top-down. You don't start with a big hunk of baby material and shave off bits until you get a baby. Right? You don't print a baby layer by layer. This is not the same manufacturing method at all. And what this is a bottom-up manufacturing process. You start with a code made from nucleic acids, imprinted in your DNA, which manufactures proteins, which manufacture components of your cell, which manufacture tissues, which manufacture a body. Okay? It's a completely different manufacturing approach than everything out there. But you still can't make an iPhone with that. You're limited in your materials and you're limited in your manufacturing techniques, and there's no intersection that gives, a biological iPhone. Okay? So we're not there yet, but we should take ideas from that to be able to get this far. So nanotechnology is one path to that. People credit the birth of nanotechnology to this talk by Richard Feynman in 1959. The talk was entitled, "There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom." Okay, and what he suggested in that talk, that it should be possible in principle to make nanoscale machines that arrange the atoms the way we want and do chemical synthesis by mechanical manipulation. So, nanotechnology 101, just to make sure we're all on the same page. That means manipulating atoms on the nanoscale. So that's on the order of collections of atoms, which are molecules. So for instance, fatty acids and nanotubes are on the single nanometer scale, tens of nanometer, proteins like insulin on the hundreds of nanometers, viruses on the micron, bacteria, etc. up the scale until we get cute kittens. Okay? So how did this revolution come about? Well, it started with understanding what atoms were, and that was only 100 years ago that we understood what chemistry and atoms were essentially about with the Bohr model. That electrons interacting gives us all the properties of atoms. It's not the nucleus, it's how electrons interact. Then in 1931, the scanning electron microscope was invented. And that was the first time we were able to see things below optical size. We could see the structure of microservices and such, like pollen molecules, what do you call it? Pollen something here. And then the transmission electron microscope allowed us to see individual atoms for the first time. And then the transistor was invented. And why is that important? Because that allowed us to invent the computers that had the computational power to start solving the basic equations of physics so we could model this stuff. Okay? Before that, we could only do things on hand, and there was no way we could solve those complicated equations. And then in 1981 came basically the fruition of Richard Feynman's prediction, the scanning probe microscope, which actually allowed us to move individual atoms around. Okay, so what does that do with our possibility space? Well, it certainly doesn't make anything cheaper, but it does expand our options. And I just want to give you an example of one of the culmination of some of that research is the discovery of the carbon nanotube, which is a nanomaterial that has amazing properties that we can use to start building up things like a bottom-up iPhone. So just a few words on nanotube. I'm just giving this as an example. There's other amazing nanomaterials. This is 25 times stronger than steel. It's half as dense as aluminum. It's 1,000 times more conductive than copper. It conducts heat twice as well as diamond. It's thermally stable up to 1500 degrees Celsius, and is a better semiconductor than silicon. So as you can see, it's a pretty crappy material. I can't think what we could use that for. But anyway, but the point is, what Richard Feynman predicted, what he was talking about was manipulating atoms, again, from the top down. He did not predict bottom-up self-assembly. So what he was talking about was a research tool, essentially, but we need a manufacturing tool. But it turns out things like carbon nanotubes can be made with a bottom-up approach. So this is the first, I mentioned the importance of the invention of the transistor. This was the first model to understand how you can make carbon nanotubes with a bottom-up approach, self-organization of atoms. And what happens here is first carbon enters a metal particle, that's a bunch of metal atoms. The particles saturate, a lot of carbon gets in there. As soon as it's saturated, no more carbon getting in there. You start to form graphene layers on the outside, you form a little cap, and that cap starts to grow. And then you start to grow a carbon nanotube, okay? And this is a bottom-up manufacturing on a nano scale. And I've had the honor and privilege to be involved in several companies that are using these types of techniques now to make products from bottom-up manufacturing. And this is the first example. I'm going to give a few examples. So this is self-assembly of optical fiber using self-assembly in the nanoscale. And what this means is we can make particles that self-assemble, that have the components needed for optical fiber in the sizes needed so that light can pass, and we make particles like this that then get deposited on optical fiber. We can draw fiber at more than 10 times the speed of traditional optical fiber, which means the price goes to 1/3. That means more data for your apps to fly across the universe. Okay? Another application in another one of my companies is to make drug particles using self-assembly. And the idea here is we create, with a self-assembling process on the nanoscale, particles that have drug in the middle, and then an encapsulation layer that protects against the environment, against moisture and oxygen and UV light, and then a nanocrystalline layer on the outside that causes these particles to flow very easily so that you can disperse them and dose them and inhale them, and now you get any drug in the world you want, inhalable as opposed to injectable or as a pill. And one of our main markets is inhalable insulin. To treat diabetes. Diabetes, for instance, is one of the main markets. It's a huge market. Some 500 million people have it, about 8% of the population. And the number one reason, there's two reasons it's not treated. One, many people don't have the money, so we make it cheaper. And two, people are afraid to take injections. 30% of people do not continue their diabetes treatment because they don't like giving themselves injections. They're risking death for fear of needles, so we solve that problem as well. And we are scaling this. This is now, we're producing about 100 grams per hour of nanostructured materials for this purpose. Another example from another one of my companies, Canatu, is using self-assembly to make flexible and transparent electronics. And what that is we make this carbon nanomaterial we call the nanobud, and there's a transmission electron image of it. And we make films of this made of random, like spaghetti on a plate, random configurations of this. We print it on substrates, and then we make devices from it. And with this, we can get 3 times higher conductivity than any other transparent conductive material, and it's flexible and formable and moldable. So now you can have all new form factors for your electronic devices. And here's some examples. Here's our production facility in Helsinki. Here's an example of display with our materials, so you get much higher contrast. You can make flexible components. Here's an example of a device that has the electronics embedded in the plastic. We can mold this stuff and you can make it foldable, etc. And yesterday, actually, we announced a partnership with Faurecia, one of the biggest automotive suppliers in Europe, to make interiors for cars that are interactive and touch sensitive with our material, because you can mold it into any shape you want and make it sexy on the inside of your car. And there's many other things you can do, because I mentioned it's very strong, it has high conductivity of heat and electricity, it's a semiconductor as well. So there's a huge patent portfolio we have around this material for all sorts of things, from solar cells to transistors to femtosecond pulse lasers to batteries to thermal acoustics, etc., that you can do with this material, because this nanostructure allows new applications. This is my latest enterprise. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how we do our nanostructuring, so that's all you get to see. The patents will be public in about 6 to 9 months, so then next talk I can give you that. But the main thing is, by doing this nanostructured self-assembly, we can get 10 times the charging speed and twice the energy of traditional lithium-ion battery. So for everybody who's rushing to an electric plug right now because their battery's about to die, those days hopefully are soon over. So we have two families of batteries, high power and high energy batteries. So the high power batteries have 5 times lower cost per kilowatt, and they charge so fast you can recharge your car, for instance, in 5 minutes. And then we have our high energy batteries with 3 times lower cost per kilowatt hour, and that gives you about 3 times the range of traditional lithium ion at the same price. And these are high enough energy to allow electric airplanes. We're already in some development agreements with some electric aircraft companies for this. It's sufficiently low cost for bridge storage, so all this trouble with renewables that are on off, we hope to solve with batteries in the field that store the energy in between. And these are sufficiently high power to finally replace the 150-year-old lead-acid battery in your car with something this size and 1/10 the weight. But one other thing that this does is solve one of the major problems with lithium-ion batteries. And ironically, this problem with lithium-ion batteries is caused by self-assembly on the nanoscale that you don't want. And I'm going to explain that. So there's good nanoassembly and there's bad nanoassembly. And by the way, I just got a text message from my friend who got off a Finnair flight, and she said that Finnair is now not allowing you to use your Galaxy 7 phone on their airplanes because of this. Okay. So why does that happen? Why do these phones keep blowing up? Well, it's a self-assembly problem. You have what's called dendrite formation. Every time you charge and discharge your lithium-ion battery, there is a self-assembly process that goes on which causes so-called dendrites to form. Okay? And if one of those dendrites makes it all the way from the anode to the cathode of your battery in your phone, all of a sudden you have rapid discharge, you have rapid heating, all the layers start to break down, you ignite your electrolyte, which is the stuff in between that lets the ions pass, and your battery explodes. The term in the industry is runaway, thermal runaway, but we all call it explosion, okay? So we solved that problem as well. So we're soon going to be manufacturing. We tested ourselves. They're very stable. This kind of performance you can't get with lithium ion. You see here, this is multiple chargings and absolutely flat performance of the battery. In a lithium ion battery, that would have dropped in 400 cycles, something like 20% your battery, when your battery degrades in your phone. So what's the state of bottom-up assembly in nanotech? So biology, you can get from this to this. We see it every day. But where are we with nanotechnology? Well, we're way at the beginning. We don't know the codes yet. We don't even know the building blocks particularly yet. We have some idea due to all this computational physics of what's going on, but we're doing a lot of guesswork. So this is truly in its infancy. And if you're interested in the next revolution, the revolution after 3D printing, please come to talk to me about nanotechnology, because that's where it's going to happen. And I have no idea how to predict where that's going to lead. And this also has an environmental component as well, because nanotechnology is extremely efficient. Self-organization is an extremely efficient way to use raw materials in the most efficient way possible. I had the pleasure, I know this is just newsworthy, I just remembered this because of Shimon Peres's death a few days ago. But I was in a conference where he gave a talk. And what does he know about nanotechnology? Turns out he knew everything about nanotechnology. It was at a nanotechnology conference. And he ended his talk talking about nanotechnology, and he said something that shocked me, confused me, and then I realized it was true. But he said at the end of his talk, ultimately nanotechnology is about doing more with less. And that's what the world, of course, needs. So, back to the question at hand. Is hardware the new software? Well, not yet. Not yet. But it's getting there. We're not as fast and cheap. We're not as easy to scale. Maybe we're profitable if you're a few key companies. We have a low barrier to entry now because of all this outsourcing. But there are a couple things that really put an advantage on hardware over software. Where do you get your revenue in software? That's always the question. It's always, the answer is, freemium and advertising. But people actually pay for hardware. Think about that. People pay for hardware. And also software, if you have a good idea, if you have Uber, there's a local Uber. Because a good idea gets repeated, and there's no true barrier to entry except your marketing prowess. Hardware has true barriers to entry, it has IT, it has the difficulty of getting hardware up. And hardware generates true passion and loyalty. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to ask you, how many times have you seen that about a software company? Okay, so that's my talk. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Please stand up for questions. Anyone welcome?
One question.
So that was really hardware.
Yes, it's about 3D printing. So 3D printing is a good innovation for aerospace. But what about certification for this all?
I didn't understand. Good.
Yes. Okay. So 3D printing is a very cool innovation for aerospace. But what about certification cases? So,
well, it's generally it's all about cost.
okay.
I mean, if you're a hobbyist, cost really doesn't matter too much. But if you're trying to make a product for people, the cost is the issue. And that's why today it's only for specialty applications and really high value applications. And this will be that way for a long time because of the cost. And there's also material limitations. So you can't do everything with 3D printing. And one of the things you have quite a bit of difficulty doing with 3D printing is printing different, I would say, families of materials. You can print different polymers on the same machine, but you can't print a polymer and a metal on the same machine.
Anyone else? I'm wondering about self-organization of growing that you mentioned. You are really out from physics world, but how it is possible to control it, and thank you, for example, of that good self-organization and bad self-organization. So there are a variety of kinds of, and any ideas how it's possible to control that?
So, like I said, we're at our infancy. We don't understand how to control. So, for instance, for the carbon nanomaterials, the carbon nanotubes example I gave, we worked for years in the lab to get parameters right that would grow the things we want. To understand exactly how it was happening, that's a long way away. But to be able to tune parameters so that day after day you can get the same thing, that's where we are.
What about self-growing fabric of nanotube that you can get a jacket?
Yes, that is happening.
With a display on its back.
Yeah. Not quite there yet, but that's coming. But nano fabric is coming. There are ways to grow nanotubes by self-assembly in what's called forests. So you grow them on a substrate, many next to each other, and then you can peel off that forest. And that's kind of a felt, like a nano felt. And then you can treat that like any other fabric.
Okay, I will be waiting for my next question.
Yeah, here I have one question. So every time, I'm reading a lot about the different kind of things, so about the nanotech, and in some cases, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there was a lot of talk that the researchers discovered new ideas, new materials, and they prolonged the battery life for they prolonged this for 10%, 50%, 100%, 200%. But again, we have 2 weeks ago, we had the new presentation of the iPhone, and the battery still sucks, right?
Yeah.
And most of the time, so this is kind of this is then at the prototype, but we don't have anything in the production in the large scale. So because of what?
Because people don't understand the building blocks yet. So it's all trial and error now. Even these computational models, to get down to the real physics of what's happening, is still too expensive computationally. So we don't have the tools to understand exactly, we don't have the computations to predict exactly. So all of these innovations are trial and error, essentially.
I would add a little bit specifically about iPhones. You consider that battery capacities did grow, actually, but the consumption grew too. Just 10 years ago, about same computing power and same capabilities as your iPhone does would require a couple of hundreds watts of consumption, which would require like a carry-on battery for that. So this is a very complex self-inducting process there.
But it's true that batteries have only improved in the past, let's say 20 years, they've only improved about 20%. And BroadBit, we're planning to double that, which is still not the 10x that we really need.
Yeah, but even Tesla is using just a huge number of these irregular 3A batteries, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the.
There is no revolution.
Well, what's inside is changing. The form factor is the same, but what's inside is changing slowly.
Our next question.
I had a question about the nanotech as well. So you actually told the story about your company. I think that actually it's not that easy to enter that market because like to establish a nanotech company you need like to invest several millions just in the lab itself. So do you see any perspective
well, it's getting
how it can get cheaper so some hobbies can start to play with nanotech?
Sure, I can say that it's getting exponentially cheaper already. So Canatu has had invested in it something like 30 million euros. BroadBit is almost as far, using outsourcing, using the knowledge gained, at about €1 million. So in my personal experience, it's gone down by a factor of 20. And I don't know how far that'll go down, but.
And now a tricky part. When do you foresee saying nanostructure production as a service, as we see now with like normal electronics hardware?
I would say that's a couple decades away. But it's not that far.
But it is going there.
It is going, yeah.
Just quiet. Anyone else want to weigh in? No physics guys here. Could you tell more a little bit aerospace industries that requires that structured materials?
Sure.
And I heard about that electrical planes that are emerging a couple of years ago. Turbine blades, that's de facto standard. You mentioned that no way. Any other applications?
Yeah, for instance,
synthetic fuels, maybe.
well, people are using basically biotech, so they're using bacteria to produce fuels now. I've been working on a couple of projects to design reactors that produce biofuels this way. But in terms of the aerospace machinery, for instance, GE last year produced the first 3D printed fuel injector. And it was a great success because they could print the fuel injector in one piece, whereas before they had to machine 15 different pieces and then assemble it. And then it's much stronger because it's a single piece, it's much more controllable, etc. So that kind of thing is going on today.
And just curious how much or less waste they produce, because subtractive manufacturing, it's like, how much, 50, 80%?
Yeah,
of
probably
waste?
80-90% for subtractive and virtually nothing.
Not a wise span of materials.
Yeah.
Okay, so as you are stunned, you can probably go for a coffee break and talk to David in less formal manner. Just take your time there, thought about your questions, and free to speak. Thank you very much.